It happened on a Thursday in late March 2025. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney walked to a podium and said something no Canadian leader had said in 7 decades. He told the world that Canada was done organizing its economy around American approval. This wasn't a policy announcement, it was a declaration of independence, economic, strategic, and permanent. And Donald Trump, by most accounts, never saw it coming. To understand why this moment matters, you have to go back to late February. At nearly 4 in the morning, Trump posted on his social platform threatening 25% tariffs across the board on Canadian imports: oil, lumber, natural gas, electricity. His framing was contemptuous. Canada had been exploiting American generosity for decades, he claimed. They would beg to negotiate. That was his word: beg. Ottawa went quiet. No emergency press conferences, no anxious leaks to journalists. For 48 hours, Carney said nothing publicly. Then he spoke. 6 minutes. Calm, almost clinical. The message was simple. Canada had been modeling tariff scenarios since 2016. Every contingency had a plan. If the United States chose economic confrontation, Canada would not retaliate. It would simply move forward, not against America, but without it. Trump's post disappeared within 2 hours. Here's what the White House appeared to have miscalculated. Canada supplies nearly a third of American oil imports. The majority of electricity flowing into northern U.S. states originates from Canadian hydroelectric infrastructure. Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania are structurally dependent on that power. Canada also supplies a significant share of prescription medications to border states and controls a substantial portion of global uranium production, the same uranium the Republican Party needs for its nuclear energy ambitions. While Trump was posting threats, the president of the European Commission was boarding a plane to Ottawa. She met with Carney in early March. When asked why Canada had become a priority, she gave a pointed answer: because Canada was about to become the most consequential trading partner the EU had anywhere in North America. They signed a preliminary agreement building a transatlantic rare earth supply chain. The United States was not included. Then came the Mexico dimension. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum traveled to Toronto for a lengthy private meeting with Carney. What they announced reshuffled the geography of continental trade. The Great Lakes Trade Corridor, a new logistics route using Canadian rail and ports, would move Mexican goods directly to Europe and Asia without crossing American territory. Mexico gained Atlantic access. Canada gained manufacturing partnerships. The United States lost an estimated $40 billion in logistics revenue and the assumption that North American trade had to flow through it. Trump reportedly called Sheinbaum afterward. Her message, delivered through diplomatic language, was straightforward. Mexico needed to diversify for its own economic security. Translation: the old arrangement no longer served Mexican interests, and Mexico was done pretending otherwise. Legally, Canada and Mexico remain in the USMCA until 2026. Carney understood something subtle here. You don't have to exit an agreement to make it irrelevant. You build parallel infrastructure so comprehensive that the agreement becomes a formality no one bothers enforcing. By mid-March, Carney unveiled $800 billion in infrastructure investment stretched across a decade. New ports on Hudson Bay, expanded rail connecting to Mexican manufacturing centers, a complete overhaul of the St. Lawrence Seaway. The financing mechanism was equally bold. Pension funds, reclassified under national security priorities, allowing below-market returns on investments that serve strategic goals. Canada was constructing an economic architecture designed by intention to root around the United States. On March 20th, Carney delivered what he called his sovereignty framework: 5 pillars. The first covered energy. Canada would prioritize domestic consumption and strategic partners in Europe and Asia. American buyers could still purchase Canadian oil and electricity at a 30% premium, indexed to whatever tariff rate Washington chose to impose. American refineries built specifically to process Canadian heavy crude face a $200 billion retrofit bill if they want to switch suppliers. That's not a leverage point Trump created. It's one Carney recognized and formalized. The second pillar addressed pharmaceuticals. Bulk exports to American distributors would end. Canada would redirect that production toward Europe and Commonwealth nations. Individual Americans with valid prescriptions would retain access through Canadian pharmacies, but the structural dependency that kept American drug prices artificially suppressed was being unwound. The third pillar was manufacturing. $70 billion in joint ventures with Mexican companies, auto parts, electronics, textiles, integrated into supply chains that stop at the U.S. border rather than crossing it. The fourth covered mineral rights. All rare earth minerals mined in Canada would be classified as strategic resources, available only to nations with reciprocal agreements. That list included the EU, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and newly added Vietnam and Indonesia. It excluded both the United States and China. The fifth pillar addressed technology and data. Canadian citizen data would be stored on Canadian servers, not routed through Silicon Valley infrastructure. American tech companies faced losing access to tens of millions of high-income consumers. Trump's response came hours later. He wrote that Canada was a weak country with no military and no leverage. He gave them 2 weeks before they came crawling back. Within 72 hours of that post, the Canadian dollar had risen against the U.S. dollar, the Toronto Stock Exchange hit a record, and applications for Canadian permanent residency from American citizens had surged nearly tenfold. People were voting with their feet, and they were walking north. Trump's available moves are limited, and each one is worse than the last. He can back down, admit the tariffs were miscalculated, negotiate as an equal partner. That requires something his behavior pattern doesn't suggest he's capable of. He can escalate, implement the tariffs, and absorb the consequences. Gas prices climb. Heating costs spike across the Midwest. Prescription drug costs become unmanageable for millions of Americans. This is the most probable path because accepting fault has never been part of the pattern. Or he can invoke emergency powers. Declare Canada a security threat, freeze trade unilaterally. This option proves every argument Carney has been making, signals to the entire world that American partnerships are inherently unreliable, and accelerates the global shift away from dollar-denominated trade. Carney has contingency responses mapped for all three. He spent years governing central banks in 2 countries, learning how to manage asymmetric pressure from larger economic actors. He knows the playbook because the playbook is predictable. There's one additional layer that deserves attention. The night before the sovereignty speech, Carney had a phone call with the Australian Prime Minister, not on his public schedule. Australian press reported they discussed coordinated resource policy among Commonwealth nations. Australia controls more than a quarter of global lithium production. Canada controls a significant share of uranium. Between them, along with New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and India, you have a bloc commanding the resources for green energy, nuclear power, and advanced technology, resources that neither China nor the United States could access without permission. Trump is focused on China as the principal rival. He appears not to have modeled the possibility that America's closest allies might construct their own economic architecture and simply not include the U.S. in the blueprint. Domestically, Canadian support for Carney's framework stands at 87% in polling. Rallies have spread across major cities. The country that built its international identity on politeness and accommodation has collectively shifted its posture. They are not hostile, but they are finished being deferential. Trump called them weak. They appear to be showing him the difference between weakness and patience, patience that has now run out. This is the part that American commentary keeps missing. Trade relationships run on trust. Over 8 years, through 2 Trump terms and a Biden administration that couldn't fully repair the damage, the United States systematically dismantled the credibility it had built over 7 decades of alliance management. It labeled Canadian steel a national security threat. It tried to assign Canada blame for an opioid crisis that its own data attributed overwhelmingly to the southern border. It used 3 a.m. social media posts as foreign policy instruments and then expected smooth negotiations the following morning. Carney eventually made a judgment that most competent analysts would have made years earlier. This pattern will not self-correct. American political incentives have structurally changed. Canada needed to prepare for a long-term future in which its southern neighbor is not a reliable counterpart. That's not hostility. That's risk management. For Americans, the practical implications are geographic and immediate. Northern state electricity bills are rising. Midwest gas prices are tied to Canadian crude that American refineries were built to process. Prescription costs for millions of people are about to detach from the Canadian pricing floor that kept them manageable. Manufacturing supply chains are getting more expensive, and for younger Americans weighing their options, political stability, public health care, infrastructure investment, a government with a legible long-term strategy, Canada just became a substantially more appealing destination. Trump is accelerating an American brain drain to Canada while apparently remaining unaware that it's happening. The question American media keeps sidestepping is the uncomfortable one. What if Canada is right? What if the North American trade relationship was always structured to extract more from Canada than it returned? What if the special relationship was only special because one side kept absorbing concessions without calling them concessions? What if this isn't Canada abandoning America, but Canada finally accounting for decades of being taken for granted? Carney isn't being provocative. He's being accurate. He looked at the data, modeled the trajectories, and concluded that Canada needed a different architecture for a different era. The fact that accuracy looks like aggression from Washington says more about Washington's assumptions than about Canada's choices. Trump set his own deadline. He said 2 weeks. Watch the numbers when that clock runs out. Watch whether it's Canadian officials calling the White House or American governors calling the White House because their constituents are furious about energy bills. Watch whether it's Ottawa seeking terms or Republican senators in competitive states quietly asking for an off-ramp because the polling is turning. Watch who bends. What we're witnessing isn't just a trade dispute. It's a test of whether democracies led by competent institutions can outmaneuver governments led by impulse. Canada is running that experiment in real time. One country is governing for the next decade. The other is governing for the next post. The world is watching which model holds.